Hello YouTube, welcome back to the channel, and I have planned for you today an arcane build. It's sort of an arcane strength build, it's sort of an arcane dex build. I suppose you could call it an arcane quality build of sorts. And I am reminded through playing this build how much I love arcane builds. Bleeds are strong, poisons are strong, sleep in a pinch is strong, though I didn't even need to use it on this character for my last play session. And I quite like having options to deal with people who are very, very latent. I've done builds like this in the past on numerous occasions. Sometimes I use non-arcane status builds on some of my builds. For an example, you could have 54 strength on your strength build, and then you can just poison infuse already strength-leaning weapons, and that way you still get fairly good damage, but you have poison. And because of the natural upgrading of the weapon, it'll deal sizable poison buildup. Bleed, on the other hand, you can do something similar. You could have bleed-infused weapons on strength-leaning weapons with a similar build, and it'll perform fairly well. However, Arcane makes it so that you build up bleed faster, and I'm not sure if it makes the bleed do more damage, but I do know it makes the bleed build up faster, which of course for bleed is more useful, because once somebody's already poisoned, hitting them with additional poison doesn't net you anything extra. Though it is nice to be able to reapply it quickly in those situations. And so I liked this build because we had 50 arcane, I think 33 strength, and 22 dex. And we're getting 4 points of arcane from the albinuric mask. Don't ask how that works. For all intents and purposes, this is Cousin Alby's actual head and face. But the nice thing about having 50 points of arcane and having middling strength and dexterity is that you can apply an arcane infusion to weapons and they will perform admirably. However, if a weapon already has bleed on it and then you arcane infuse it, it will increase that bleed buildup. If a weapon has bleed on it and you give it a blood infusion, it won't make much of a difference. So that is something to be aware of. So your inventory ends up being a mixed bag, quite literally, of weapons that are arcane infused because they already have bleed on them, and weapons that you have blood infused because they don't have any bleed on them. And it's a good time. I like being able to get hits on people, and especially when they're very latent, because you're basically building up essentially a critical hit meter, and then if you can make sure that you just get the damaging hit, that it is a confirmed hit on them when the bleed goes off, even if they're latent, it's like you get all those other little hits back. Not all of them, of course, but you get something back, and it can help even the odds in your favor. Every time I play some sort of status build, I am reminded how terribly, terribly useful it is to have an option against latent players. I've talked about latent players far too often, and don't worry, that'll be the end of it for this episode. But I gotta say, of all of the arcane hybrid builds you could come up with, I am really a fan of the arcane strength variety, and I understand that arcane faith builds are incredibly strong, probably more viable in several ways, but the arcane strength build has the Mogwin Sacred Spear, which I adore. It's a very long great spear, and you have good damage, you have good range, you have good stagger on it, you can interrupt a lot of people. It is a rollicking good time, and if you haven't played with this weapon, I recommend you do. Even if you were to somehow rip its Ash of War from it, I still think it is a great weapon. And I must say, I like that, Rivers of Blood and the Mogwin Sacred Spear, that they have an element on them. The Regalia of Eokide, or however that's said, the little drill straight sword, and the Marius Greatsword, or Executioner Greatsword, has magic damage. So I think it's pretty neat that there are options out there for not just doing physical or status damage necessarily, but there are also options for doing elemental damage as an arcane build. It adds a little extra depth to them that I rather enjoy. And I didn't use the Marius Executioner Greatsword or anything like that on this character, but that's one of the boons you get when you have a decent amount of strength and a good amount of arcane. And it's more noticeable when you are playing through the lands between doing PvE and you're trying to match up damage types to enemies who might be weak to certain damage types. Because it's nice to switch. Sometimes you fight a boss or something like that and they're just strong against what you got, especially if your build is a 1 damage type build. That's why I rather enjoy that strength builds, of course, have access to the 3 different types of physical damage, and then they also get a fire infusion. Dex builds, of course, they have access to all the physical damage types, and they have lightning in their back pocket. Faith builds could do sacred or fire or lightning if you're using spells. Magic builds, wizard builds, they're kind of stuck. They're kind of stuck with just magic or, in very rare instances, physical on those int builds. And so any build that can pull out an extra damage type, I think is a good thing, at least for the PvE experience. For PvP, not really that important. Players aren't usually going to have terribly high resistances unless they are buffing. But this was an interesting interaction where I met some fellow Albinuric mask-wearing fellows, or other fellow Albinurics if I'm going to keep up the facade. And I didn't realize it at the time, but they were waiting for somebody. Recusant Restless Mind. I didn't realize who that was at first, but that is none other than YouTuber and Twitch streamer Steelovsky. And he showed up, saw we were all wearing the stupid mask, having our little fight club going on here, and he decided to watch. And so it was kind of nice that I could have a little interaction with these people. It's kind of funny, the longer I play and the more I try to make myself aware of the community, the more people I brush shoulders with, even if ever so briefly. And I didn't realize it was Steelovsky at this point in the fight. That's why I stood there, because I was expecting the other co-invader to just interrupt the fight, because why wouldn't he? He doesn't have context. But no, he goes off and does his own little thing. And so we have this fight, and I realized across the course of this build that the Greatsword and the Mogwin Sacred Spear were probably my favorite choices for the build. I kept going back to them, though other weapons were neat and nice. That's what we have. And, of course, we're going to take a moment and zoom in. There's Steelovsky with his Spyglass taking a look at us. Neat little interaction. It's stuff like that that makes me smile. In fact, I think it's when I saw that Spyglass in real time that I realized who it was, checked my recent players, opened up his stream, realized I was correct. I wasn't even actively watching him. I don't really watch streamers all that often. I don't have the patience for it most of the time, which feels bad, but it's not that they have bad content. I feel too old for a constantly moving chat and live streaming kind of thing. I feel very old school, and that's probably why I make these videos with, dialogue on the fly, but after the fact. Look at that. Even though I don't have a whole lot of decks, the Nagakiba is still a really terribly good weapon. And so for those of you who are aware of contemporary things, Steelovsky got a little in trouble for not outright condemning people using the chainsaw. There's a little drama about it. And he wasn't condoning it either. He just didn't outright condemn it. And I think this guy, since his name is Cheating is Bad, he was trying to point that out to Steelovsky because he was streaming at the time that I recorded this footage. So, funny little thing. I think he was there to do either a chainsaw or some other move swap glitch. Just as a joke, as a little gif and a gaff. Far less malicious than plaguing randos is, of course, plaguing your friends. Funny that. And this invasion, I was tempted to cut it because I was like, oh my goodness. This invasion. 3 wizards all bearing down on me. Can barely get a moment to breathe. There's no cover on this slope. I'm just taking heaps of damage, eating up resources, not being particularly smart. I should have bailed far sooner. But I suppose that damage they were putting out inspired them to stick around instead of just fog wall me. So I take a moment, I get away from them, I gather myself, and I go, alright, we gotta take down these wizards. They can't win. I can't let them win. It's a spite sort of thing. We gotta get them back. And so once I have a moment to get my resources back up, get my head screwed on straight, we pull out the Mogwin Sacred Spear because we need range and we need stumble and we need damage, and doggone it, 2 great spears are excellent at that. There's a reason it is a popular choice. And though I would have probably gained a lot from using a smaller, lighter weapon like a light thrusting sword, the Mogwin Sacred Spear offers the big damage so that we can take out people. And this was the turning point in the fight right here. As I swap to the great bow, we launch a flurry of arrows. That guy thankfully stops, instantly obliterated. No clue he has 376 HP. That must be the minimum HP. He might have been wearing something that lowered his HP, I suppose, but I can't think of many situations where you'd have less than that. That is a very low amount of vigor. Terrible, in fact. So if you're ever invading people, and it feels tough in a 3v1, and you have your head screwed on tight, I would recommend trying to do just a little bit of damage to each person, because sometimes you might have it revealed to you that one of them just has awful HP, and if that's the case, you can of course just vigor check them very easily. Yeah, they don't have, they can't make as many mistakes as you can. And this guy almost gets me. Look at that one skull, and I eat a stupid piece of rotten dumpling and survive. Not the wisest choice. I was still getting up to speed with my invading. You know, I feel like at the end of the evening when I'm tired, but I've done a lot of invasions, that's when everything starts clicking and the footage gets a little better and I'm making smarter decisions. I'm thinking about things and I'm trying to, you know, manage my stamina and manage my spacing and backing off and going around corners. You know, all the smart things an invader should need and ought to do if they want to stay alive. The fundamentals of invading that aren't necessarily the fundamentals of combat. Because if you die once, they win. But you can get them close numerous times and they can keep coming back and covering each other. So there's always going to be that little give and take. But still, it's so very, very satisfying when you do happen to win against those 3v1s. And in, of course, that case of that previous invasion, I had no help. But in this map, the Halictree, I love the Halictree. And a lot of people seem to like it too for PvP. I like that I have so many mobs to back me up, and they're reasonable mobs. And of course, everyone else has their builds, everyone's the proper level, everyone is as they should be. Nobody's caught off guard, you're not bullying new people. If they're all the way here at the Halictree and they're somewhere around 138, they aren't completely empty in the head. Not completely. And I am so lucky that that guy didn't decide to do that immediately, that he tried to go for a light attack. That Hand of Melania, still a spooky, spooky weapon. You can deal with it, but it still scares me. And that's another thing I'm reminded of continually while playing Souls games in general, is so much of the game is knowledge checks, one after another. Even if your execution's a little shabby, even if you're not precise with your inputs, having a knowledge base and knowing what to generally or broadly avoid can save your life. Like this Hand of Melania. He dropped down on me and thankfully I didn't get a whole flurry and I was able to get away. And I've taken to doing this recently. It's not the bravest idea, or sorry, it's not the brightest idea. It takes a foolish amount of bravery, I should say. But using the Mogwin Sacred Spear's Blood Boon ritual very close to other people, when they're distracted for but a moment, and if your damage output is good enough, it'll scare them off. They won't try to trade too much with you. It is a risky idea because anyone who knows how to pivot backstab is going to make a fool of you. So that's something to always be aware of. If you think you're fighting some sort of high skill player, don't leave your back open. Maybe put your back to a wall or something if you're going to do something that risky. I don't know. The ball's really in your court. Oh, and another thing that has to go along with the footage is because we have 33 strength, we can wield the bleeding greatsword, or a blood greatsword. And I love this silly thing, and though I was being foolish with my Braggart's Roar, I love that the Braggart's Roar R2 into R1 is a combo. And of course, because we have a good amount of Arcane 50 on this build, it means that we're going to bleed very easily on that second hit if the first hit doesn't bleed him. But look at this crouch poke. Pop, he's gone. Oh man, the crouch poke already does good damage on a greatsword. Adding a bleed to that, it just hits so hard. And the first hit was a ghost hit, I believe. So that's all we needed to be able to pop that phantom out of existence right there. Did you see that free aim right there? Oh man, free aiming a pot makes me feel good, and I recently went back to Dark Souls 3 ever so briefly. I was offline, I had a Steam Deck, I decided to play a little Dark Souls 3 just to relax, recuperate, and maybe have a little bit of nostalgia. And going back to it, the arc on bombs, which were that game's pots essentially, is incredibly different. In fact, they seem way heavier. And so my free throwing of bombs was just horribly off. And there's so many slight adjustments between the two games now that I've gone back. And there are many quality of life changes, and I didn't recognize them. Oh, that was stamp upward cut in that last clip. I wasn't really talking about it, I apologize. But if you crouch poke somebody with a greatsword and your connection's good enough and you do the stamp uppercut, the crouch poke into stamp uppercut will connect if they panic roll specifically. I think if they were to delay it, they'd be fine, but why wouldn't you panic roll? You just got crouch poked by an ultra greatsword. That's gonna hurt. Doesn't feel nice. It's understandable that they panic roll. I'm pretty certain I panic roll still when it happens to me. So that's something I need to get a little better at. But I just love the options that are available to you when you focus Arcane on a build. It's nice when your build feels coherent, I should say. This is a problem whenever I am theory crafting builds, is sometimes you'll come across elements and you're trying to stick everything together. It's like doing a paladin, right? A paladin build, for instance. Let's say majority strength, 54 or so, and like 30 faith for your damage stats. You made a lot of sacrifices to get those numbers. What can adequately use strength and faith? Well, it's somber weapons. There's no infusion for strength faith. And even if you take a very strength leaning weapon and put a sacred infusion on it, it's just not going to be using both of your stats as adequately as it could. Arcane and bleeds are a little bit of an exception because they still have okay scaling with the stats that aren't the primary one. So I've been trying to put together a paladin build, and that was a pitfall I ran into, is it felt like I had weapons that were pulling from different stats, and when everything pulls from the same stat and your build's working together, it's gelling, it's got chemistry with itself, you feel it. You feel like all your weapons are fairly well optimized, that everything's going to work well, you're pumping out that damage. And so those hybrid builds have a little trouble. Thankfully, there are weapons you can rely on, for instance, with the Paladin build. And I should probably save the conversation for when I do actually get you footage for the build, but I'll leave it there. And say that you do have access to somber weapons like the Ordovis Greatsword, the Siluria Great Tree, Great Spear, Great Lance, whatever it's called. Siluria's... I want to say it's Siluria's Woe, but I don't... that doesn't sound quite right. But it's the Siluria Great Spear, essentially. They are these weapons that have good strength, and they also pull from your faith a good amount, and you just don't have an infusion for that. It's like how there's no longer an infusion for faith int. It just kind of feels bad, and if you want to use any of those spells that use both of those, there is no infusion for you, unlike Dark Souls 3, which feels a little bad, but there is unfortunately only like 3 weapons that you could possibly get to pull from both faith and int, and they're kind of middling weapons, so it's not really much of an option. So that's why I really appreciate arcane builds in my weird, long, roundabout sort of way. Oh, here's another instance of that thing I was talking about earlier where I blood Boon ritual in the middle of danger just because it looks like I have a moment. And strangely enough, it paid off more than once for me, which is a horrible and a bad habit to get into. But you're able to vigor check people and save the field boss, who is your ultimate cover, quite readily. My goodness, I just took a look at the timeline and I realized we're almost done with the video. It just went by in a flash for me, so I hope you enjoyed the footage. I hope I may have inspired you. Maybe you'll make an arcane build of your own, and you don't even need to use the filthy Mask of Vare if you don't want to. You don't have to be an edgelord. You can wear whatever you want, and you can still have pretty good damage. And these two, bless their hearts, I was able to get so many hits with my great bow at a distance. I was debating whether or not I should switch to the golem great bow, which is a little heavy for all the stuff I like to have on my bar. But I just kept getting hits, over which is a lot of free damage if you think about it. I've been trying to relate things not in terms of health bar, as if the health bar isn't real necessarily, and more of how many resources I've depleted from my enemy. At least in those fights where you don't just outright kill him. And I feel bad that he lost his phantom there. I was looking for a more exciting fight than that. But look, we're fighting somebody with a bleed greatsword, a man after my own heart, and for some reason he's using Bloodhound Step. And I don't think anyone told him that it got patched. And watch him abuse Bloodhound Step and see how he's going shorter and shorter distances. Not only is he getting diminishing returns, but he's losing iframes. He's easier to hit And if you watch carefully, I'm gonna switch to the knife and we're gonna roll catch him, and that'll be the end of my video. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope you enjoy what's left of it for you. Bye-bye now.